So welcome to the latest High Ground podcast with Greg and I. We're breaking new ground here, aren't we? We're in a proper podcast studio for a change with a few people behind the cameras as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it all goes.
We are very plush. So.
Yeah, on a very, very hot day. Yeah,
so we haven't got to rely on your technical ability either.
Well, thanks. We may have to do the editing. The topical issue today, though, is stockpiles, because both of us have been involved in the media this last week. It's been very, very topical. We're going to get into it all. You know, how many weapons do you buy? How many weapons is enough to have in the stockpiles? Yep. When is it wasting money and when is it not? And I think part of the reason that I got into this week is there were news that Ukraine is now buying 10 million drones a year. 10 million.
Yeah.
It's getting through hundreds of millions of bullets, millions of artillery shells. And that's just not possible to have those sort of stockpiles. So at some point, you've got to transition from your stockpile to industry providing stuff. But you and I have spent a lifetime in the military. Every one item, particularly missiles, costs a lot of money. If you put them in a stockpile and never use them, it's a bit of waste. So philosophically, how big is a decent-sized stockpile?
Yeah, it's always a difficult conundrum. And I think we keep reproving the assumptions that we've used in the past. You and I were chatting about this earlier. I mean, we used to use like a 6-month assumption for a major conflict, but of course that's been blown out of the water. And even if you do make an assumption, you know, it then goes horribly wrong either through the timeline or the usage rate. We've seen that in the Gulf, in Iran, with American stockpiles.
But I wonder whether, because those assumptions that we used to use were largely based on the fact that we were doing wars of choice, wasn't it? So I remember being in the Ministry of Defence. You know, they looked at certain parts of the world, and we were talking with the Falkland Islands. You know, it wasn't predicted, but it was a relatively short, sharp. The Gulf War, short, sharp. Afghanistan wasn't, but the way we participated in it. So in the last 35 to 40 years, ever since the collapse of the end of the Cold War, it feels like the set of assumptions upon which we've based our buying. Right, we're going to be active for 6 months. What's the rate of effort? How many missiles are we going to need? That is, let's suppose it was 1,000. We're going to take risk at that because we can't really afford all of those. Yeah. So therefore, we'll buy 800. Yeah. The challenge is those assumptions just don't work for major wars of national survival, do they?
No, and the worst part of it is if you do get the assumption wrong, you can't then suddenly rush to the factory and say, look, we got that a bit wrong. Can you turn the machines on, please? We've seen that even in America, where they do have the capacity that we don't. And some of these weapons take several years to manufacture. So, yeah, the idea that you can recover from a mistake is no longer there.
No, and it also does depend a lot on the types of weapons, doesn't it? I mean, I was looking at, if you remember right at the start of the war, there was some discussion about artillery shells in Ukraine, that we use a different diameter of artillery shell than the former Soviet Union, 155 versus 152. It's only 3 millimeters, but it means you can't
get stuck in a tube.
So, but actually, therefore, it's relatively simple to spin up a defense industry to make a bullet or an artillery shell. Yeah. As soon as you're looking at missiles, missiles are a massive different components. They're all made by a very niche ecosystem that's set up for a particular time and place. Yeah. So how do you philosophically manage stockpiles? Do you, in a purely idealistic world, I'd go, how long does it take for defense industry to ramp up? 2 years. Yeah. Right, I need a stockpile of 2 years worth of stock.
Yeah.
That's just not practical. So how do we manage that?
Well, you're right about it not being practical, but of course, what's the alternative? Because the alternative is to have your fingers crossed or build more factories. So it is almost the case that you've got to spend the money here. You've got to put the hard yards in. You've got to have that bedrock, not just because you might have to use it, but it's the deterrent effect of telling your enemy, if you want to start something, I'm ready for the long term. So unfortunately, there is a cost here. Now, you've got to make those weapons relevant for those 2 years, software upgrades, whatever it might be. But that's something we can have a chat about in a minute. But yeah, I think it is a question here of putting your money where your mouth is.
But I'm not sure it's something that can be solved. If you looked at, so for example, in the Ukraine war, let's take the Iran war as an example. At the moment, ballistic missiles seem to be the big thing. Mm-hmm. So you go, right, we need a stockpile of Patriot missiles that can cover all eventualities. Well, I don't have the actual numbers because Iran will never let us have the actual numbers. But if you look at Russia's war with Ukraine, they are now on a war footing building 60 ballistic missiles every single month.
Yeah.
That's about the same number as America's building Patriot missiles. But you and I both know you don't fire one Patriot to shoot one ballistic missile.
Two-shot doctrine in America.
It is, because the probability of kill isn't 100%, so you send up 2. And, of course, Ukraine isn't the only customer for Patriot missiles. Therefore, in effect, Russia is building missiles at double the rate that anybody in the West can shoot them down.
I think Patriot's the perfect example. And I think if you make an assumption on one war that you're thinking that you might fight, then you'll come up with a number. And presumably America came up with that number and thought it had a good stockpile. That stockpile then started getting whittled away as Ukraine started to use it up. And we saw the tension in America about whether you would continue to give them supplies. America then starts the war in Iran and has to then lend Patriots to all the Gulf allies in order to protect themselves. So you've ended up employing those weapons for 2 wars, neither of which you were planning to fight, which have now depleted the stocks that you had for the war you haven't yet fought. So and that's the problem when you're a single source supply. And I think that's the current conundrum in America. Ukraine have said, look, we'll build these under license. But Lockheed Martin and Raytheon are going, whoa, you're not having our IP. That's our secret source. We're making a lot of money out of that. And therefore, nobody wants to give away the secrets. So you've got a real problem here. So you either need to develop your own system that does the equivalent and build it faster and cheaper, or you've got a very long queue at the Patriot factory.
Do you think it is that people like Lockheed and Raytheon are reluctant to give away IP? Because I wonder, you and I have been involved around the defence industry long enough that, let's use Joint Strike Fighter as an example. The fact that we are a partner in a program, does that mean that we get the same Joint Strike Fighter as every other customer does? Because the reality is that the hardware is one thing, the software is quite another. And I'm old enough and ugly enough and grey enough to know that when I turn my defensive aids dial from 0 to 10, do I get exactly the same capability that America gets or maybe other customers? My point being is that there's the hardware of Patriot, but the sexy bit of Patriot is how the hell you hit a target that's travelling several times the speed of sound. Because the PAC-3s, I think, have to hit their target. That's all in the software. And I do wonder whether you can keep an asymmetric advantage in the software.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that, and we've always known that America probably does keep a little bit back for themselves and does its own development and its own secret trials, etc. So you could maybe keep that bit back, and that's your special sauce, if you like. But actually, I think the weapon itself is so sophisticated in all its environments that I think there is a genuine concern. Now, we don't know the truth, but it was certainly reported yesterday that both Lockheed and Raytheon are reluctant to give Ukraine the license. And no one else currently builds under license, so it is a problem.
Now, I think there may be an alternative reason why they've said that. And part of that is, if you imagine a Patriot, it's probably made up of at least 1,000 different components.
And some.
Each of those components is made by a bespoke factory in a bespoke part of the world, probably America. And those suppliers are scaled to deliver 2 Patriots a day, which is currently their production rate. If you now allow somebody to build them under license, they can't set up 1,000 different sub-suppliers. They're going to go to those same suppliers. And therefore, it's a competition for those, particularly when America's just turned around and said, I want more Patriots. I want to go up from 600 a year to 2,000 a year.
Yeah, I'm sure that is true. I'm sure, and as you well know, sometimes it's a little widget or a washer that holds up production. So there will be some very practical reasons why this is hard to do. But then the entire supply chain needs to up its game. Now, America, of course, has got a second problem. It's not just about equipping Ukraine. They've also run out for their contingency. So when you start looking at China and you've got Trump rattling his saber in the Indo-Pacific, it's a bit hollow now because everybody kind of knows that America has depleted its stocks and won't recover those for several years. So it's a problem for everybody.
But do you think that whole story, I mean, it's an interesting rabbit hole. Do you think that story is true, that Hegseth has sort of promised to keep providing weapons, and then suddenly, the military can stand up and go, hang on a minute, you do realise that you haven't got enough supplies now? Because it sounded ironic when I thought, no, nobody could do that. But you and I were chatting that when we were in the MOD, we had stockpiles of things like Paveway 4, which is a guided 1,000-pound bomb. that we were dishing away, and people went, "Oh, don't worry about the stockpiles. We don't worry about that anymore."
Yeah.
Do you think that's really where America's got itself to?
I think we definitely made those mistakes in the past. We made them at the time probably for good reason, but in changing your assumptions and thinking that you had spare was the mistake that we made. In America, what appears to have happened is that whoever drew up the plan for Iran said, "Here's your best case scenario: victory in a week. It'll be done and dusted, and we'll have instant victory like we did in Venezuela." I bet you there were military plans said, or the nightmare scenario is this drags on, Iran hangs in there, Straits of Hormuz is shut, now you're in a long-term attritional fight, and they are going to attack Gulf countries. I bet you that was in the plan, and I bet you it was kind of pushed to the back going, yeah, that's not going to happen. And it has. And all the assumptions, therefore, that would have been attached to that option are now coming true. Now, at some point, the military would have said, right, stop. We are now in a place which we are not comfortable. And I'm pretty sure that's been said, albeit in private, although it's starting to break into the news cycle now. And you've then got the types of characters like Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump who aren't into the game of subtlety. They'll keep pushing the argument. And if your argument against Iran is we're going to keep bombing you back to the Stone Age, you can't then have people saying, yeah, we can't actually do that. We can get to the Bronze Age, but we run out of missiles, which is exactly where they are. And they're trying to hide that fact, understandably so. Nobody wants to declare the fact they're naked and empty. But they have got to that position.
I wonder if it's almost a little bit worse than that, though, because there were talk, wasn't there, that the Crown Prince, Saudi Crown Prince, had sort of intervened directly with President Trump, even though President Trump had said the Middle East welcomes our efforts, but actually going directly and going, you do realise that you're causing absolute havoc commercially. It's also the threats that we're having. Unless you can guarantee our security. Now, of course, America can't do that. No. They're using up loads of Patriot missiles to defend not only Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and loads of other nations. Yeah. And they know that actually Iran's ballistic missile supply will exceed the ability for Patriots to take this stuff out of the sky. So America suddenly found itself, I think, in a situation where it went, President Trump wants to keep threatening Iran. Iran will keep firing ballistic missiles. We will therefore exhaust our stock of Patriots. We don't have enough Patriots now to deal with China. Yeah. And by the way, industry says, yeah, we can sort that out, but it'll be 2030 before we're ready.
And that's exactly why America in this, it's not just about losing to Iran. That's one thing. I mean, losing is a, sort of individual term. You can come to your own interpretation. But, what it has exposed is that America isn't the guarantor in all cases. There's now a limit to what it can do. And I think what America's declared here, mistakenly, is its limit. And for allies who have been used to America using their land in order to prosecute or hold Iran at threat, it's all beginning to backfire. And it's all coming down to this lack of stockpiles. If America could just give all those Gulf countries endless supplies of Patriots and air defense weapons, and they were having a 100% success rate, you could carry on with your strategy because you could say, I've got you protected. But so stockpiles isn't just hurting you. It then hurts your own strategy. It hurts your relationship with allies.
But I guess my point here is if America can't do it, and they've got, a $1.5 trillion budget, they spend more on defense than the whole of NATO put together. If they can't make technology their asymmetric advantage in wars of national survival, what hope has anybody else? And therefore, I guess my point is it a fundamentally flawed assumption now we have used to underpin defence that we're going to fight in Afghanistan against a bunch of third world militarily nations, Iraq, Iran, whatever. Now all of a sudden you go, for wars of national survival, what we've exposed is the central pillar of our defence strategy, which technology is our asymmetric advantage, is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, maybe we can thank America for that, because if you compare Ukraine and Iran, I think there's a fascinating comparison to be drawn, because in another parallel universe, Trump would have achieved total victory in 10 days, and we'd all be looking at, wow, it's the technology that did it. So we wouldn't have come to the conclusion that perhaps we are coming to now, is that actually, if your strategy's flawed, any physical capacity or technological advantage isn't going to be enough to tip you over the edge. And I think that's the problem in Iran. I think the aims and the objectives, which we still have never really seen written down clearly, were unachievable through military means alone. They either required a bit of luck or they required Iran to basically capitulate, neither of which happened. So, and then you end up in the scenario which we've ended up in Ukraine, clearly, where you do have that attritional standoff war. Now, it's not the same with Iran. That standoff is perhaps a little bit more distant, but it is a standoff, and both sides seem to have sort of semi-equal leverage. So yeah, technology is not necessarily a solution, which brings you back to the stockpile argument, because we've relied in the past on having that technological edge, which means you don't need the mass that stockpiles require. So it's very convenient, isn't it? You need less weapons because they're much cleverer. Or yes, the weapon itself costs more, but I don't need 1,000 of them. So instead of saying 1,000 bomber raid as you would have done in the 1940s, you send 10 aeroplanes with 10 weapons and they achieve, the same effect. Except it doesn't.
No, and I do wonder, we're back at, well, the one thing we haven't really talked about is that the actual technology bit. So the danger with stockpiles is you invest so much money buying the items that you have to keep them for a long time. And my example would be Storm Shadow. We had that in stock for 30 years. Yeah. Now, I think we paid $2 million a copy, so it's $1 billion. We bought 1,000 of them, so it must have been a $2 billion buy. Yeah. We only used about 150 of them on operations. We gave a load to Ukraine only because it saved us having to dispose of them, and then we upgraded some. But I guess my point being is that Storm Shadow was always considered a very technologically capable missile. But if you look back 30 years, what was your mobile phone 30 years ago?
Yeah.
How fast has technology moved in that time? This is antiquated, it's archaic.
Yeah.
And if you try and equate that to what Ukraine's been doing on the front line, innovating rapidly on an almost nightly basis, stockpiles, you can stockpile explosives because that probably will never change. Maybe the rocket pack and maybe the seeker, but the software, the capability, you can't stockpile in the same sort of way. And it just feels another part of the foundation of our strategy of having stockpiles of weapons, because that way we don't have to get into an attritional war.
Yeah.
Feels more and more flawed.
Yeah, Storm Shadow is a really good case example, because you could argue it's an old weapon, it's done its time, but actually, it was way ahead of its time when it came out. And why did we have it? Because we had two problems to solve. We needed to fire far enough away from a target that the target couldn't shoot back at us. So it's very nice to be able to stay away from the threat. And we needed to be able to go very, very deep into hardened concrete. It does both of those things very well. It turns out that being able to fire a missile quite a long distance when there are threats out there is still relevant today. It's just in the intervening periods in counterinsurgency, we could get close to the target, so we could use cheaper weapons in order to have the same effect. Now that we're in wars where peer on peer is now more likely and the threats are going to be, quite prominent, you need that standoff again. So actually, Storm Shadow's gone full circle and become relevant again. Now, there will be better versions of Storm Shadow, and there are some being developed already that will ultimately replace it. But actually, it's still a relevant weapon, because the concepts that designed it in the 80s are still are revalid again today. Range, penetration, and explosive capability, the physics that still exist. But yeah, you're right. Developing a weapon and thinking you're going to still be using it 30 years' time is beginning to look less and less likely, based especially from what we see in Ukraine.
I also wonder whether our doctrine will change. I know it's a horrible word for a podcast, but the way we prosecute wars, because I think if you look at the way UK is conducting attacks, we sort of hold our powder dry, we retaliate when somebody has a go at us, we retaliate. The danger is nowadays is because over the last 35 years, we've consolidated, we've put all our eggs in one basket, all our air transport at Bryce Norton, we've got Farningdales as a rate. All of these things form a list of targets. So if I was now Russia or China, I'd have a day one, minute one, I'm going to take out all of those. I know where your facility is as MBDA Stevenage that makes your complex weapons.
Giving it away.
Sorry. That's going to be targeted. I'm going to schwack all of this stuff on day one.
Well, look, that's the other end of the equation of stockpiles. If your enemy has a large stockpile and therefore you're going to be under threat, you disperse all your stuff so that it can't all be struck on minute one, day one. And we have not done that. So in the same efficiency measures that we took to reduce our stockpiles are the very same efficiency measures we took to put everything in one place, or all our eggs in similar baskets, which then creates a much easier problem set for your enemy to then prosecute, which means they don't need as big a stockpile. So yeah, we've screwed the problem up from both ends.
The other question, I think, with the Storm Shadow example was quite good, because the the philosophy, which we're getting to the end of at the moment, is we buy stockpiles of weapons, these high-tech missiles, bombs, Storm Shadow, whatever. At the end of their life, what do you do with them?
Yeah.
And in the past, we've had to spend a lot of money with defence to get rid of them.
Yeah.
But there's also the philosophy that how do you train with these weapons? Now, Storm Shadow is not a great example. I don't know. Did you ever fire one from?
I didn't fire Storm Shadow. No,
no, because the Harrier wasn't big enough to carry. I think the Storm Shadow was bigger than
Storm Shadow carried the Harrier.
But things like paveways and particularly air-to-air missiles, so AIM-9Ls, 9 Golfs. Yeah. We used to get rid of those by actually firing them off, didn't we? At the end of their time, and actually it was a lot of fun. But actually, the principle was throughout the life of weapons, you can't just simply have a stockpile and watch it and wrap it in cotton wool, because it isn't just about you and I pulling the trigger, watching this thing whoosh off. It's actually about these bombs are not generally stored with their fuses and everything. They've got to be assembled. Yeah. They've got to be put onto the jets. You need the armourers. You need everybody to be training. Yeah. I don't know if you remember the first time you walked around a jet and there was a red little pin with a flag hanging off it. And
well, hopefully you took it out, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, just the process of taking it out. Yeah. And then you get airborne and you look at your master arm switch in the cockpit, which generally up to that point had been just another switch. Yeah, yeah. Now you went, huh?
No, it's a big match temperament thing, isn't it? And we introduced sort of training stocks for that very reason. But you're right, they were kind of for twofold reasons. One is it was important for training, keeping yourself up to speed. But the second reason was actually they were rather expensive to destroy properly. So the best way to do it was chuck them at a rock in the North Sea and dispose them that way. Any green activists, shut your ears. But and bizarrely, when the MOD ever does go to war, it actually starts saving money because it removes all that disposal cost by using weapons, which is a bit perverse. But yeah, the management of stockpile, the management of weapons and their ultimate destruction or disposal is all part of that cost factor. And I think a lot of the reasons why we reduced our stockpile was those factors became almost overriding of the reason why you had the stockpile in the first place, which was to deter a war. And it suddenly became a cost thing. So, yeah, you need to factor all of those factors into this.
It's also, I remember one of my fun tales was that, remember when we had cluster bombs, CBUs, that 147 bomblets?
147. The Princess Di, bless her, she got rid of those.
But we used to, the only reason we had lots of bomblets was it were an area weapon, wasn't it? It was the size of a football pitch, wasn't it? And therefore, if the tank was in there, you pretty much likely going to hit it.
Well,
yeah, but that was what it said on the tin. And we carried up to 7 of these things.
Yeah. We could get 8 as well.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. It's big enough you could stuff one in the cockpit somewhere.
I was going to say.
But the point was, when we went to, I remember a red flag once, and we were trying to dispose of these weapons. So they took loads out. And we had the opportunity, I think we ended up drawing straws or something, but one jet was going to deliver 7, in fact it was 2 or 3 jets, deliver 7 on a bombing run, which might sound, but first of all, when you went out and looked at the jet, the wings were hanging down, trying to hold these things up. Yeah. Secondly, when you got airborne, it didn't really want to get airborne.
No.
Because the aerodynamics around the wing and it was really heavy.
Yeah, it's very different.
Thirdly, you had the throttle in a slightly further forward through the whole sortie, so it burning up a lot more fuel. Now, I know all of this you could predict.
Yeah.
But when it happens for real. And then the final one was we were used to pickling. You go across the target, dink, there goes the bomb. Yeah. Because these things are delivered, you had to hold the button down for well over a second to get all of these off.
Yeah, yeah.
And pansy pickling, I think, was remember the time. But the whole point was that actually it was so rare that you got to do this. Yeah. And part of the danger of the jet was if you were too low delivering it, some of these bomblets actually came up and took you out.
No, so it was a whole learned process until you'd experienced it. But weapons like Storm Shadow is a good example. The only time you ever took that off for real was to fire it in anger. And we did have one dummy weapon that prior to the first Gulf War was being used by crews to get used to the aerodynamics. And I actually know the navigator concerned, whose name I will not mention, and they went through all the switches and actually pickled it off.
Oh.
So that went into the desert. So, yeah, that was denied for everybody else. So everyone else was then firing it for the first time. And that is, that's a big deal.
Did you ever do any Sidewinder firings as well?
Yeah, Apple Valley, yeah.
Because, Tornado wasn't, but you did different tours, didn't you?
Yeah.
But, I mean, the Harrier was never really an air combat, but we carried it for self-defense. Yeah. But what was interesting is you do in the simulator, blah, blah. when you get airborne, the whole range at Aberporth, it was really stage managed, wasn't it? Because you had a Jindavik aircraft, then it would be turning a flare, which you couldn't see. You had to get yourself in the right position.
Yeah.
And then they'd turn the flare on or light the flare. You'd be closing in on it, lock it up, fire it off. And because they were old, so many of the missiles didn't go off. And if they didn't go off, suddenly they were a real problem when you got back to the base. Because there's stuff. But it was just a really, and I remember the buzz of adrenaline when this thing went whooshing off the rails. We shot down a few Jindaviks over the years as well, didn't we?
No, I nearly had the opportunity, the F-18, to do an AIM-7, so a radar-guided missile thing. But they only got two crews a year were allowed to do it. And they eventually realised I was a Brit and I shouldn't really get my turn. So a Canadian got it instead. But it's quite rare. I mean, we're trying to get better at this. I think simulation helps. You can obviously now go through most of the process, but there's nothing to replicate that moment of adrenaline when it finally comes off the rail and the sheer, especially if you do it at night. I mean, now, one of the benefits, should we say, of current operations is we've now got an awful lot of Typhoon crews and probably F-35 crews who are now doing this in live wars. And so they're getting the experience the hard way. It's never ideal, but it's at least means they'll be better the next time.
Yeah, and I think that's the important point, isn't it? I know, going back to this CBU cluster bomb unit issue, I remember in Red Flag, you go up north and you get refueling and everything. Yeah. We struggled to get up to the height for the tanker.
Yeah.
And it's not something, of course you know about it, but because you've done so many times, you've flown with tanks on and that's it. Suddenly now you've got tanks and wall-to-wall ordnance.
And those tactics to run away from an air defence fighter.
Yeah, you limp away rather than run away.
Yeah.
I guess, so where I'm taking some of this conversation is that it feels like our weapons are either stockpiles, they're disposable, we're going to use them, and when we run out, it's all a bit... Or we've got equipment that we can't replace in the time available of a major war. Therefore, it's got to be survivable.
Yeah.
And therefore, we've got what we've got at the start of war to endure.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, where does this leave these collaborative combat aircraft? Because they feel as if they're cheaper than the real thing, a manned or unmanned, crewed, a platform. And there's some of the conversation that talks about them potentially being a bit disposable.
Yeah.
But if they're not survivable, then actually they're a waste of money because they're going to be lost on day one and industry will never be able to create replacements.
Yeah.
So where does this leave the logic of CCAs?
So this is something that is done within the military. So what's called operational requirement and the physics that come up with these concepts is you look at the problem set. The problem set is you've got to get from A to B. A being where you take off from, your territory, B being the target. You've got to get a weapon somehow onto that target to create a certain effect. Now, you can do that by having a weapon that you launch from home base. It never comes back, hits the target one time out of 5 or whatever that might be. It costs £500,000 and you can tick that off, go, right. Now, is it more cost effective to do that with a Typhoon with some cheaper weapons, which gets the bombs to within 20 miles and the bomb does the last bit and we guarantee the Typhoon coming home again? And actually, if you have to repeat that over a 6-month period, that is the more cost-effective way of doing it. And I think that is the conundrum we now see with these CCAs. The CCAs not only improve the survivability of the package, the crewed aircraft, because they act as either decoys or bomb or weapon carriers, but they also can carry those weapons into the target area too. And that, when you do the maths of let's say a Spear 3, which is the sort of new longer range brimstone type weapon, that will be, let's pick a figure, I can't remember what the figure, let's say it's £500,000. If that £500,000 fired 4 times and then again 12 hours later and again 12 hours later, because the CCA comes back and keeps doing it, is cheaper than the £1 million missile that you've got to fire from 1,000 miles away, then the economics add up. And I think that's what CCAs are still struggling to come to the point where that number can be calculated. And then we will end up then with a balance. And I think what you're probably seeing in Ukraine is they're probably testing and adjusting. They go, right, we need a longer missile. Right, just build one. And okay, it's having a 25% success rate. Well, that's okay because it's really cheap. fine, keep going. Or actually, that's not good enough. Stop that production, right? Look for something else. Look for another solution. And I think that's where we are at the moment with CCAs. We haven't yet quite worked out that calculation between a long-range missile at higher expense versus a shorter-range missile delivered by a CCA, which ultimately is more cost-effective in the long term.
But I think that if you follow that logic through, there then is a question. I read a lovely article the other day that talked about the advent of these ballistic missiles. Because they leave the Earth's atmosphere, they go several times the speed of sound, they're festeringly difficult to shoot down. But countries like North Korea, countries like Iran have developed these missiles, and it seems like it's easier to produce those than it is to produce the defensive systems. So surely that opens the door that the next generation of threat that we should be developing is ballistic missiles that can target anywhere we like, and with great accuracy create a real problem for your enemy. And philosophically then, if anybody threatens you, you almost have a tripwire response to them. That isn't nuclear, but is going, right, we're going to launch 100 ballistic missiles at you, surgically take out the eyes and the ears, and leave you incapable. In other words, almost punching them first. You've walked into the bar with a gun holstered. I'm going to shoot you.
We're not doing that again. You're absolutely right. Now, I think that is the fundamental difference between Ukraine and Iran. So in Ukraine does not have the capacity or capability to defeat Russia. So it's in a defensive crouch. It'll hold the line on the borders, and it will use those air defense missiles to keep shooting missiles out of the sky. So it's on the back foot to a large extent. In Iran, America shouldn't have been on the back foot. It should have been going, right, I've got a better capability than you. I'm going to win. You're going to give up. But it didn't happen. And so they're now back on the defensive again, because that's exactly what's happened. Now, there is a danger here that in looking at the defensive solutions, we build golden domes, whatever you want to call them, and we then live within that bubble and we can protect ourselves. Or you go for exactly what you just described, is overwhelming force the other way that says, if you pull the trigger once, we're going to pull the trigger 1,000 times, and we are going to put you back in the Stone Age, Korea, Iran, whoever you might be. The problem is, that hasn't kind of worked in Iran. And there's the challenge here. So how do you have enough of a conventional deterrent capability, which you could argue before America started the war in Iran, it had. Iran was being mischievous, if I'm being slightly obtuse, but it wasn't invading countries outright. It was doing it under the radar, that because of its fear of American conventional overmatch. But now that America's played its hand, Iran have gone, well, actually, do you know what? We can absorb this. We can see our way through out the other side. So how do you deter the use of these weapons in the first place? Because it's quite dangerous to fire a ballistic missile at a nuclear nation, because you don't know what's coming at you. I think it was a Netflix series, wasn't it? About, the weapons on the way to America when they don't know what the source is, they don't know what they are. And the whole country goes into stasis as trying to figure out whether it should respond with a nuclear weapon. So I think people playing with ballistic missiles as some routine conventional capability is taking us into some quite dangerous territory. And I think that's where we now have to rethink the way we apply deterrence against nations like that.
But what I like about that philosophy, though, it draws me back to Putin has been testing us with the Yantar in the North Sea. It's been submarines on our undersea cables. It's been probing northern defences. Its drones have been landing in NATO territory and exploding. And we don't seem to have done anything. And occasionally, you and I pop up on the media or social media and go, we should be more robust. And I get loads of negative feedback from some of the military seniors. Go, you've got to be careful about that. You go, okay. And I'm always drawn back to the Turkish example where two Russian aircraft went in 2014 or whatever. One turned back, one didn't, and it got shot down. Putin goes apoplectic, but he never sent something in there again. And it feels like the more we allow ourselves to be tested, the more the danger is that we get compromised. And I do wonder whether there is a different approach, that if you're going to thump us, you're going to come at us with a knife, we're going to come at you with a machine gun. In other words, we're not going to try to make it proportional anymore. We have to defend ourselves, and you've got to know that we're going to be
I think you're about to get into your best untouchables. The Sean Connery, eat your heart out. Yes, all of the above. And I think this, for me, is the real conundrum, because a stockpile in itself is not enough. If you don't have the will to use it, then people will push you and test you, and that's exactly what Russia's doing. If you're going to draw a line on what's acceptable, you need to then act when that line is crossed. Now, in Ukraine, we've acted by just giving them more protection, just more stuff. What we haven't done is, look, if you do that again, or if you start hitting this or that, we're going to get involved. Which would then have Russia recalculate. Now, everyone wants to shy away from that, and we've done other podcasts talking about the potential for that. But if you're not going to hold that line, then where's it going to end up? And the danger in not holding the line early is you then start crossing into this nuclear sort of ambiguity that we have already had in Ukraine, where we've had Putin rattling sabers, using weapons that are potentially nuclear capable. You've definitely started to cross the line. And that then makes the world more dangerous. Whereas everyone says, oh, you're trying to get involved in World War III. No, we're trying to stop a World War III.
So how does that, going back to that sort of whole theme of stockpiles, it's pretty evident that we can't do it nationally anymore.
Yeah.
So surely,
cases.
Yeah. So we've got to rely on the alliances, whether that's NATO, European, or whatever. But again, you're going to rely heavily on the stockpiles of other nations then. And as we're seeing now, when I go through Poland on the way to Ukraine, they are utterly focused on the war that's ahead of them. They're not likely to want to share weapons with anybody else because they know they don't have enough to deter Russia, and therefore they've got to be ready. We're going to be looking west probably rather than east and have a different set of weapons. How do we prepare ourselves properly in terms of stockpiles of weapons and deterrence, with a small d, not the nuclear, to ensure that Russia, that currently has its nation on a war footing, it is generating the quantities required. And if I was a military advisor to Putin at the moment, I'd be going, now is the best time to invade NATO. They won't have the appetite, or they don't have the weapons, and we are replacing them faster than they're still prevaricating. It'll be years before they're ready to go.
As we wrote in our book, of course, exactly that scenario, that actually this is the point of most danger. The UK isn't in as bad a situation as other nations. We actually do make some of our own weapons, and some pretty capable ones too, to the point where America is quite nervous about them as competitors and therefore deny their use on American airplanes like F-35. So there are some issues there about sovereignty, about not only the ability to build and therefore guarantee the supply chain, but also the ability to integrate them on a weapon system. And we've currently got that challenge on F-35. France do it. So there is a question here about, well, how much more of this can we do? So we diversify the supply chain, we have multiple supplies, or we build under license, back to that point we made right at the beginning about whether that's possible. Could we build Paveway 4 over here, by the way, in greater numbers? So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're using a foreign system like an American weapon, but it is a bad thing if you're no longer at the front of the queue, or there is not enough capacity for all of you to get what you need, which is exactly where we are today. We do need to fix this. Now, we either design some cheaper weapons that we can afford to build quicker. That's where some of these sort of drone solutions come in. So using your example of the BL-755, do we ever need to drop a weapon within 40 miles of the front line of our own troops in a close air support environment, with drones now able to do it? The answer is probably no. Right, well, you can cross those off your stockpile requirement. Army, you take care of that part of the battle space. The Air Force can now focus on the deeper fight. And those waters are becoming muddy because the armies are now getting weapon systems that can go a bit further than that. So how much further does their responsibility go? So there is a problem set here, and it isn't just about getting at the head of the queue of the one factory in America that builds Paveway 4s. It is about either having more factories or more diverse weapon selections.
Yeah, and it feels like this quantity versus quality argument, because we have gone down the quality side because we've always said that's our asymmetric advantage. Yeah. But actually, that's no longer affordable for certainly wars of national survival.
Well, the argument was always that one Paveway 4 would have as much effect as 8 old-fashioned 1,000-pounders. So, right, get rid of the 8,000-pounders, got one Paveway. Well, that's great, but you have actually reduced the stockpile by 8. Now, if the effect's the same, that's okay. But over the years, we got those numbers down to such small numbers that even a small, contained conflict or an ally that wanted some spares would very, very quickly deplete that down to very small numbers.
And you could build the 1,000 pounders very quickly. I mean, but it feels like we're always going full
millions
circle.
Of them left
yeah,
over
no,
from the
exactly.
Second World
But
War.
you know, we were doing 1,000 bomber raids. Each of the Lancasters had 20 bombs on.
Yeah.
The fact that they got within 4 miles of the target, that's why you needed all these bombs. And even then, you couldn't guarantee to hit the target.
Yeah.
But you did have a massive effect on the ground, and it feels like, do we go for more and more expensive platforms, CCAs, that we can afford fewer of them? Or do you actually go down the Strike Master route, which is huge quantities, some will get through, and therefore, I just think philosophically, this whole question of stockpiles is much bigger than simply how many weapons do we buy? Yeah,
it is. And ultimately, there's a money point to this. And right now in defence in the UK, we know that is an issue, has been for a while. We've heard a lot about money being spent on stockpiles. I'm almost 100% certain that there is more money being poured into this to try and fix the problem. But I also know from bitter experience that the queue at the factory door is already quite long. So even if you do turn up with your cheque, you'll be told to get to the back of the queue.
It's clearly not the answer, is it?
Well, it's not working, that's true.
Thanks, Greg.
Cheers, Sean.